History versus visions. It requires courage to cast the accumulated myths of a lifetime to the wind. Our natural desire for simplicity, certitude, and the approval of others occasionally causes us to defend even our most flawed worldviews as if our very lives depended on them. Dead belief systems are difficult to bury, for in doing so we enter a world we do not recognize. We watch the carefully crafted towers of our understanding crash down in ruins, and we lose an integral piece of the only reality we have known, reinforced and imprinted on our minds by 1,000 voices, internal and external. John Perazzo. Nowhere has history been more enthralled to belief systems, visions, than in the history of racial and ethnic groups. Too often the past has been twisted to fit the visions and agendas of the present. Much of the history written about minority groups has in fact been a history of how others treated these groups, more so than a history of the groups themselves. This bias has distorted both the histories of racial and ethnic groups and the histories of the societies in which they have lived. Black Americans are just one of the groups whose history has been seen in this strange and twisted way as a commentary on American society and an opportunity to score ideological points, or promote guilt, or gain some contemporary political advantage. Mention Japanese Americans and internment camps come up. Mention Mexican Americans and the things suffered by them or by Mexico are sure to become the focus of discussion. Injustices should not be swept under the rug, but whole peoples are more than the sum of the injustices they have suffered. At least they should be seen as more if history is truly to be history and not just the projection into the past of contemporary visions and agendas. Where world history is concerned, the same skewed approach has too often prevailed. Few things attract less attention than the achievements of the West, which have improved the lives of people around the world through medical science, technology, and economic organizations more effective at producing the material output on which people depend for food, shelter, and the comforts and amenities of life. Those who warn against being Eurocentric are themselves often the most Eurocentric of all when it comes to assigning blame for slavery, imperialism, wars, and other human tragedies that have originated on every inhabited continent at one period of history or another. Multiculturalism has not meant warts and all portraits of different societies around the world. For many, it has meant virtually a warts-only portrait of the West and a no-warts portrait of non-Western peoples. More is involved than a simple bias, however. The central doctrine of multiculturalism, the equality of cultures, cannot be sustained when that means equality of concrete achievements, educationally, economically, or otherwise. It is not only the West whose achievements must be brushed aside or glided over in silence. Particularly dangerous to contemporary visions and agendas are achievements by groups that began in poverty and rose to prosperity, such as immigrants from Japan, Italy, China, or India, who settled in various countries around the world. It is not just their achievements, but the very concept of achievement, which is antithetical to the multicultural vision, and which is therefore often evaded or denied. Much verbal ingenuity has been used circumventing the concept of achievements by calling them advantages or privileges, even when this does violence to the meanings of words and the facts of history. Often, discussions of the supposedly impenetrable social barriers of poverty and skin color prejudice pass over in utter silence the history of various immigrants from Asia, whose economic levels have in fact often begun in poverty and later surpassed that of the white majorities in countries of the Western Hemisphere. When visions and agendas suppress history, that not only distorts the achievements of groups, nations, or civilizations, it forfeits valuable knowledge as to the things that have led to past progress and can lead to progress for others who are still lagging today. In short, it sacrifices the material interests of millions for the ideological or other parochial interests of a few. History and causation. History offers not simply a chronicle of events, but more importantly, opportunities to gain insights about the human condition from the experiences of other times and places. That is, it offers not merely facts, but explanations. When it comes to the history of different racial, ethnic, or other social groups, nothing calls more obviously for explanation than the great differences in rewards and performances among them. Here, causal explanations impinge on prevailing visions. Where the prevailing vision is one of external causation, verbal ingenuity often seeks to banish internal explanations. External versus internal explanations. One of the ways of sealing off a vision from the intrusion of discordant facts is with an ideological vocabulary that neutralizes such facts. One of the most important facts to be neutralized and excluded a priori from the prevailing vision of our times is the fact of differences in capabilities among individuals, groups, nations, and civilizations. When achievements are described as advantages or privileges, differences in outcomes ex post are treated as evidence or proof of differences in opportunities ex ante. What these verbal fashions accomplish, in a wide range of circumstances, is to preclude internal explanations of intergroup differences in favor of external explanations. Thus, the success of Lebanese businessmen in competing with their European counterparts in colonial Africa has been attributed to various Lebanese advantages. Firstly, the Lebanese had lower personal consumption levels than the Europeans. Besides, they had the advantage of having members of the family work in their shops and thus be an economic asset instead of a liability, as was the case with the Europeans. In a situation where Lebanese skill was at least as good as their rivals, they could win over a gradually increasing share of the business by price competition. In addition, the Lebanese skill was in some respects superior to that of the Europeans. The former had many more contacts with the African clients, were willing to talk and bargain with them at length, and therefore had closer knowledge of them. As a result, they could grant credit to the Africans with less risk than the Europeans, could have earlier indications of shift in consumer demand or crop prospects, and could manage the repayment relationship more skillfully. Another advantage of the Lebanese, in the early days at least, was that little of his profit had to be diverted to the amortization of fixed capital, because there was little fixed capital. Thus, successful price competition by the Lebanese merchant was based on the advantages of both lower business and personal costs. Not one of these internal achievements of the Lebanese was due to any external benefits being made available to them that were not equally available to Europeans. On the contrary, the Lebanese typically began with less money than their European rivals, though even their little fixed capital is described as though it were an asset. But such a situation would not have been confined to the early days before the Lebanese achieved prosperity if, in fact, it were an asset. Here again, the vocabulary of the prevailing vision must neutralize or evade the plain fact that some people achieve better than others by describing the means of their achievements as advantages. If the very concept of achievement is a threat to the vision, then overcoming adversity is even more of a threat. Both must be verbally transformed into privileges and advantages in order to protect the vision. Conversely, the failure of particular people to achieve is often transformed verbally into a denial of access or opportunity to them by others. Those who do not meet the same standards for college admissions or mortgage loans as often as others do are said to be denied an opportunity for a higher education or access to loans to buy a home. Any adverse information on such groups must be verbally transformed into stereotypes or myths. There simply cannot be any facts contrary to the vision. This vision has become part of the law of the land, so that an American employer can be found guilty of discrimination without a speck of evidence of discrimination against any specific individual if the demographic makeup of his workforce differs from what prevailing preconceptions say it would be in the absence of discrimination. The absurd limit to which this vocabulary can go is illustrated by scholarly, or at least academic, studies of Malaysia that describe the Malays as a deprived group there and non-Malay minorities as having privilege, because the latter have had greater economic success than the Malay majority, which controls the government, and which is guaranteed various benefits that are denied to non-Malays. Prejudice is another word that has been distorted beyond recognition in order to sustain a vision. The straightforward meaning of prejudice, prejudgment, is, in an ethnic or racial context, stretched and twisted to mean any adverse opinion about a minority group. This implicitly assumes that any unfavorable judgment about the behavior or performance of any minorities cannot have any factual basis, and so can only be explained as being a result of a prejudgment. But when German Jews in America were socially accepted into many elite circles from which all Jews were later barred after an influx of Eastern European Jews, the origins of these barriers cannot have been anti-Jewish prejudice as such, though the persistence of such barriers long after Eastern European Jews had become acculturated to American society shows the weight of inertia. Similarly, blacks lived in white neighborhoods in many northern cities in the late 19th century, and their children went to racially integrated schools before the massive influx of blacks from the South at the beginning of the 20th century. Can the change to racial segregation in both housing and schools be attributed to prejudice or to experience? To say that it must have been prejudice is itself a prejudgment. Again, inertia would cause these adverse reactions to outlast the circumstances which gave rise to them, and to apply to individuals quite different from those whose behavior provoked racial barriers in the first place. Blacks are by no means the only ethnic group whose advancement has been promoted by its own internal transformations, with greater acceptance by the surrounding population, being in effect, more so than a cause, of the group's advancement. Acculturated German Jews who had achieved respectability and social acceptance in 19th century America lamented the arrival of masses of Eastern European Jews who were far less acculturated, less educated, and were often poverty-stricken. The German Jews' fear, which proved to be well-founded, was that the arrival of huge numbers of such people, foreign in appearance and repellent in behavior to American society at large, would lead to hostility and barriers against all Jews. This understanding led, among other things, to organized attempts by German Jews to assimilate the Eastern European Jews to American standards of behavior, cleanliness, and lifestyle. This internal transformation of the Jewish population led over the years to lessening hostility and greater acceptance by the American population as a whole. Again, this did not mean that there were no inveterate anti-Semites who would be hostile to Jews in spite of anything that the latter could do. But neither can hostility to Jews, after the arrival of vast numbers from Eastern Europe, be explained as simply an arbitrary prejudice, especially coming after German Jews had already been accepted, even in the higher reaches of society. In the case of immigrants from Ireland, the massive efforts of the Catholic Church in the 19th century to Americanize Irish immigrants are seldom mentioned among the reasons why the "No Irish Need Apply" signs faded away during the 20th century. The picture too often presented might lead one to believe that it was all just a matter of prejudice and bigotry in American society that led to such signs in the first place, leaving their disappearance in later times unexplained, except by some such generality as progress, or by the efforts of the enlightened to dispel such prejudices and bigotry. The very possibility that the Irish themselves were different in the 20th century from what they had been in the 19th century is too often passed over in silence. The long social struggle that led to this result virtually disappears from history, as seen by those who make prejudice an all-purpose explanation. This not only deprives these and other minorities of credit for past improvements, more importantly, it deprives others today of a potentially valuable example of ways of improving their own futures. Strained terminology such as prejudice is just one aspect of the power of a vision. A prevailing vision can become the default setting for thought and action. Assertions consistent with the vision can be made without meeting the additional requirement that they be consistent with the facts. Indeed, facts themselves may be viewed suspiciously or subjected to higher standards of proof when they are inconsistent with the vision. Achievements have preconditions, and those preconditions, whether internal to those seeking achievement or external aspects of the surrounding world, would need to be considered. Redefining achievements out of existence avoids all these complications that distract from ideological visions and political agendas. But neither internal nor external preconditions can be ignored if we are serious about history and its integrity as a record that can be relied on when weighing present-day alternatives. The history of groups and whole nations that rose from poverty to prosperity is especially valuable for those who would like to see today's lagging groups advance. But the experiences of such groups are an especially dangerous threat to those with a vision of external causation. Immigrants from Asia to various countries around the world have been prominent among groups that have risen from poverty to prosperity, often in the face of racial discrimination. One of the remarkable things about people from China and India has long been that they have prospered in countries around the world, except in their own homelands. Even with all due allowance for selective migration, the immigrants including more than their share of able and ambitious people, there has still been a striking contrast between the ethnic Chinese economic domination of the economies of a number of Southeast Asian countries and the poverty of the Chinese in China. As late as 1994, the 36 million overseas Chinese produced as much wealth as the billion people living in China itself. Immigrants from India living in the United States averaged higher incomes than the American population. People of Japanese ancestry have likewise had higher incomes than the average American in the United States and higher than the average Canadian in Canada, while in Brazil they have owned 3/4 as much land as there is in Japan. In all these cases, economic success stories began in poverty. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese immigrants to the United States were domestic servants and agricultural field hands to an even greater extent than Black Americans. As late as 1920, a majority of all the Chinese living in the United States were either laundry workers or restaurant workers. Most overseas Indians began their careers in the 19th century in East Africa, Fiji, Trinidad, and Guyana as indentured laborers. In more recent times, Korean immigrants to the United States have likewise begun at the bottom and progressed upward into small businesses and their children into the professions. While some may regard such experiences as inspiring and a heartening example of what can be done to overcome poverty, to those with a vested interest in the prevailing vision in the media and in academic social science, including history, these stories undermine their fundamental beliefs and the general thrust of welfare state government. To the political representatives of other groups that are still lagging behind the general economic and social levels of their societies at large, the success of Asian immigrants is resented. Whether to Maoris in New Zealand or blacks in the United States, Asian immigrant success stories are bitter medicine. The stirring up of animosity and even violence toward Asian bloodsuckers by racial activists is just one consequence of this. At higher intellectual levels, the rise of Asian immigrants from poverty is often glided over in silence when portraying less successful groups as victims of arbitrary barriers based on race, or when depicting external circumstances in general as decisive factors in group advancement. Still less does the success of Asian immigrants support the view that protests and politics are key requirements for raising lagging groups out of poverty. Any reasonably informed American, for example, can far more easily name 5 prominent black leaders than can name even one prominent Chinese American or Japanese American leader. The fact that the Chinese have long prospered better outside of China and Indians outside of India undermines the multicultural view that Western prosperity in general is not due to any superior features of Western institutions. The fact that both China and India have had sharp upturns in their economic growth rates after they began transforming their economies in the direction of Western capitalism toward the end of the 20th century provides further evidence against current efforts at promoting a neutral agnosticism about differences among societies. It is not just ethnic minorities whose fates tend to be explained or explained away by external circumstances in keeping with the prevailing vision among intellectuals. So have behavior patterns among Southern whites. Cotton has created Cotton has created another culture pattern for the South. The seasonal and cyclical nature of his money not only serves to give the cotton grower a shifting standard of living, but throws him back upon credit and prevents his acquiring habits of thrift. After a season of deprivation and close living on niggardly credit, comes the sale of the crop and cash income to be husbanded, if possible, until the sale of next year's crop. The income of the cotton grower has its peaks of high prices, but these peaks are not planned for, and they do not serve to level up the general standard of living. In the cotton belt, luxuries are likely to be bought on the spur of the moment during a good season in cotton and to be paid for in the poverty of next year's living. One can neither exercise a systematic thrift, budget expenses, nor indulge in installment buying on irregular returns from cotton. This ignores the fact that the ancestors of these people lived in the same spur-of-the-moment way on the other side of the Atlantic, in places where cotton did not grow. But once an external explanation of behavior is available, internal explanations are seldom sought, and weighing the two against one another is rarer still. That is what is meant by saying that the prevailing vision is the default setting for many. Poverty is one of the most widely used external explanations of intergroup differences, but, like other external explanations, it is seldom tested empirically against alternative internal explanations. Many poorer groups lag in intellectual development, but others do not. As noted in an earlier essay, poor Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century made use of free public libraries in New York, and the books they checked out were primarily serious works, while lighter and more popular books were left gathering dust on the library shelves. Among their ancestors in Eastern Europe, a century earlier, even the poorest somehow managed to have books in their homes, while the larger population around them were overwhelmingly illiterate. A similar pattern was found among the people in 18th century Scotland. Even a person of relatively modest means had his own collection of books, and what he couldn't afford he could get at the local lending library, which by 1750 virtually every town of any size enjoyed. At about the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson was complaining that there was not a single bookstore in his vicinity, and a century later, Frederick Law Olmsted commented on how seldom he saw books, even in the homes of Southerners who could have afforded them. Still later in the 20th century, E. Franklin Frazier commented on how seldom even black college faculty read books. Nothing better illustrates the dominance of unsubstantiated dogma over empirical evidence than the pervasive belief that the advancement of economically or socially lagging groups requires a sense of group pride, identity, and self-esteem, and that self-hate must be exterminated as a barrier to such advance. The plausibility of this belief is not in question. What is open to very serious question is whether or not it is supported by any hard evidence. Yet such evidence is seldom asked for or given. Putting aside for the moment the emotionally loaded terms of such discussions, is it in fact the case that groups which exhibit pride and identity advance faster or further than groups which see themselves as inferior in achievement, knowledge, and sophistication to some other groups whose progress they wish to emulate? Ultimately, this is an empirical question and does not depend on anyone's philosophical or ideological orientation, though such orientations may make some more willing or less willing to investigate the empirical evidence. Any serious investigation must begin with an understanding that we cannot see directly into the hearts and minds of other human beings. All that we can see are the outward manifestations. This simple fact must be confronted at the outset as equally applicable to those who hold one belief rather than another, rather than have it surface at the end when one set of beliefs has failed the empirical tests and seeks escape by saying that we have not discussed real pride or real self-hate as they exist in the recesses of other people's minds. Judging by what we can see and by what history has recorded, what is, in fact, the track record of breastbeating versus the cultural cringe? A definitive answer would require an encyclopedic survey of history that would take longer than anyone's lifetime. However, we get along with less than definitive answers to most of life's questions, so this is not an insuperable barrier to learning what we can and reaching tentative conclusions, subject to later revision. Modest as this goal may be, it is better than a blind refusal to look at the facts, for fear that they will undermine some cherished belief. Two of the most remarkable examples of dramatic advancement by whole peoples have been the Scots in the 18th century and the Japanese in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Both provide evidence on the issues of pride versus self-hate. Scotland. As far back as Roman times, Scotland lagged behind England, and as late as the 14th century, there was said to be no Scottish baron who could write his own name. Scottish agriculture was primitive, and its industry virtually non-existent. The people were illiterate, and there was no law and order except for the arbitrary edicts of local clan chiefs. The largest city in Scotland in the 17th century, Edinburgh, had a population of just 16,000. Part of the reason for Scotland's lag behind England was geographic isolation. Scotland was on the outer fringes of European civilization. England was closer to continental Europe, which was for centuries more advanced than the British Isles, so that cultural artifacts of a more advanced civilization found their way across the Channel to the English. But whatever the reason, the Scots lagged behind the English, and were painfully aware of that fact. After centuries of conflict, the English invaded Scotland, first the Lowlands and then the Highlands. They conquered Scotland both militarily and culturally. Scots were conscious to a painful degree of their backwardness, their poverty, their lack of polish, their provinciality. Scots began to speak English, usually with a heavy accent. A society for promoting the reading and speaking of the English language was formed, and lectures on the subject drew hundreds, including James Boswell. Even such an intellectual giant as David Hume took lessons in English pronunciation, and he warned fellow Scots against using peculiarly Scottish expressions, a warning repeated both in his letters and in Scots Magazine. James Mill deliberately purged his speech of Scottish pronunciation and expressions. He moved to England and raised John Stuart Mill and his other children as Englishmen who never heard him speak of Scotland, nor was he unique. Demeaning or not, the overwhelming desire to pass as English and to transcend Scottish origins was symbolic of the more pervasive fertilization of Scottish life with external influences. It eventually facilitated the universalization of Scottish scholarship, which was the hallmark of the Enlightenment and the outreach of its own culture. Back in Scotland, Lowland Scots copied the English, and Highland Scots copied the Lowland Scots. Scottish farmers even used an English plough that was completely unsuitable for the soil of Scotland. In short, 18th century Scots represented a clear example of the cultural cringe. What was the result? First of all, the spread of the English language, beginning in the Scottish lowlands, opened a whole new world of literature in numerous fields to the Scots, fields in which there was little or no literature in the indigenous Gaelic language. Education caught on so widely in the Scottish lowlands that they had compulsory education before England did, and developed the most extensive system of schools in Europe. Not only an educated class, but an intellectual class developed in Scotland. As a distinguished historian put it, in every branch of knowledge, this once poor and ignorant people produced original and successful thinkers. From the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, most of the leading British intellectual figures were either from Scotland or of Scottish ancestry. These included David Hume in philosophy, Adam Smith in economics, Joseph Black in chemistry, Robert Adam in architecture, James Watt in engineering, Sir Walter Scott in literature, and John Stuart Mill in economics, philosophy, and political science. In medicine, Scots likewise moved to the forefront, not only in Britain, but also in Russia, where Catherine the Great had a Scottish physician, and in America, where Scots established some of the earliest medical schools. Scots also set the world standard in engineering in general and shipbuilding in particular. By 1871, nearly half the ships built in Great Britain were built in Scotland. Scottish universities surged ahead of English universities in science and engineering. In short, the Scots eventually surpassed those from whom they had once learned. Japan. The isolation which has often kept some societies lagging far behind others was a self-imposed isolation for Japan. From 1638 to 1868, emigration from Japan was forbidden on pain of death, and foreigners and foreign trade and foreign cultures were kept out. In short, Japan was one of the most self-insulated countries in history, and was also very poor and backward. This era ended dramatically when American warships, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, entered Japanese waters in 1854 and demanded that Japan open its ports to the outside world. Helpless in the face of such overwhelming modern force, Japan had no choice but to submit to this demand. It was a turning point in the country's history. This painful demonstration of Japan's weakness and backwardness before its own people and before the world set in motion internal reforms and an agenda for national development that dominated the country's history for the next century. Japan's leaders in that era held up the West in general, and the United States in particular, as examples to be emulated. Western technology was imported, and Japanese students were sent to study in the West. The English language began to be taught in Japanese schools, and there was even a suggestion at one point that English be made the national language of Japan. Textbooks issued by the Japanese government held up Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin as models for the young to imitate, even more so than Japanese heroes. There were euphoric descriptions of the United States as an earthly paradise. It would be hard to find a more striking example of the cultural cringe than 19th century Japan. An episode shortly after Americans forced Japan to open up to the outside world illustrates the situation at that time. Commodore Perry presented a train as a gift, and the Americans proceeded to demonstrate it. At first, the Japanese watched the train fearfully from a safe distance, and when the engine began to move, they uttered cries of astonishment and drew in their breath. Before long, they were inspecting it closely, stroking it, and riding on it, and they kept this up throughout the day. No one could have predicted then that, a century later, Japan would produce its own bullet train that surpassed anything available in the United States. But it happened only because the Japanese recognized their own initial backwardness and were determined to overcome it. They began by learning all that they could from the West and emulating the West until they reached the point when they had amassed the knowledge, skill, and experience to take their own independent direction. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese products were widely known as cheap, inferior imitations of European or American products. Even after Japan later began to produce higher quality products, such as cameras, the first Canon was an imitation of the German Leica, and the first Nikon was an imitation of its German rival, the Contax. Over time, however, these and other Japanese cameras evolved into the leading cameras in the world, both technologically and in terms of sales. Similarly spectacular developments occurred when the Japanese entered the electronics, automotive, and other fields. Black Americans. Against the background of the history of Scotland and Japan, today's assumptions about the effects of pride and self-hate as factors in progress are hard to sustain. Against the history of blacks in the United States, many other assumptions are equally hard to sustain. The history of the black population of the United States might be summed up in broad outlines as follows. Sold into slavery by African leaders at a time when slavery was widely accepted in all civilizations, blacks entered a particular segment of American society and culture at the bottom, acquiring only the rudiments of Western civilization, not including literacy in most cases, and a way of life influenced by a peculiar redneck culture. Freed after the Civil War, but poverty-stricken, illiterate, unskilled, and unacculturated to the demanding way of life in a free republic with a market economy, blacks began their history as a free people at the bottom of American society. One sign of their lack of preparation for life as a free people was a rate of mortality among blacks in the aftermath of emancipation that was greater than it had been under slavery. This was just one sign of a more general lag in adjusting to the norms of the society around them. The small enclaves of New England culture transplanted among blacks via Oberlin College and Dunbar High School, as well as in black colleges established in the South by New Englanders, did not promote pride in the existing black redneck culture. On the contrary, The clear message in these enclaves was that the way most blacks talked, the way they behaved, and the whole set of redneck values they inherited were all wrong and were things to be overcome. The wholly disproportionate number of black leaders and high achievers who came out of these small enclaves is further evidence in the case of pride versus self-hate. Among both blacks and white liberals, there were those who thought that cultural changes among blacks were unnecessary, that there could be progress without internal cultural change, effects without causes. In the post-1960s world, such views gained the ascendancy, and those who held these views often wondered why it was so hard to raise ghetto blacks out of poverty and social disintegration. Their answer was usually a call for more welfare state programs, more pride and self-esteem, more steeping in the history of black achievement or white injustice. The actual track record of this approach, compared to the opposite approach in the New England enclaves, received virtually no attention. Fortunately, in the decades before this mindset became fixed, most blacks had become better educated and had lifted themselves out of poverty at a rate higher than that after the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. For example, more blacks rose into professional and other higher-level occupations in the years preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the years following its enactment. This factual history served no one's political agenda and has since been replaced by a fictional history that does. The economic advancement of blacks has been widely portrayed as due to the civil rights movement and to political leaders, black and white, who have proclaimed themselves champions of black Americans. Since no one has as large a vested interest in opposing this view as its proponents have in perpetuating it, the politically more convenient view has prevailed, along with attributing the continuing economic and social gaps between blacks and whites to the sins and shortcomings of the latter. Nothing is easier to find than sins and shortcomings among human beings, regardless of their race. The question is, how much of a causal factor of these moral failings have been in history, and to what extent have they been effects rather than causes? For example, the decline in whites' hostility and discrimination toward blacks in northern cities during the 19th century, followed by a resurgence of hostility at the turn of the century, were not just inexplicable swings of the pendulum in white public opinion. The masses of blacks arriving in the North at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century were denounced in the black newspapers of the time for their crudeness, violence, and crime. It was not just a question of perceptions or stereotypes among whites, though undoubtedly some whites reacted in ways wholly unjustified by the situation, as elements of other racial groups do. Contemporary preoccupation with the evils of society distorts the history of many groups, passing over internal improvements that took decades or generations of effort, because those improvements, whether modest or dramatic, implied that there was something that needed to be improved within these groups, that not all their problems were due to the perceptions or stereotypes of others. Clinging to a counterproductive culture in the name of group pride and avoiding changes because they could be labeled self-hate are patterns that have no track record that would justify optimism. The evidence is all on the other side, but that matters only to those who value evidence over ideology, history over visions. Cosmic justice and injustice. Few things are more common or more painful than sharp contrasts between the prosperity of some racial or ethnic groups and the poverty of others in the same society. At one time, such things were accepted as either divinely ordained or as being a consequence of innate racial characteristics. However, as both these explanations were discarded over time, a new notion arose, that these economic contrasts were consequences of injustices visited upon minorities by majorities. Yet that explanation is not without its own serious problems, as great as the problems of earlier explanations that did not stand the test of time. One of the strongest arguments against the injustice explanation of intergroup differences is that, in many countries around the world, minorities with virtually no political power or other means of discriminating against the majority population have nevertheless been far more successful, economically, educationally, or otherwise, than those who constitute the bulk of the nation's people. This has long been true of the Chinese in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, Germans in Russia and Brazil, Jews in Eastern Europe and the United States, Lebanese in West Africa, Scots in North America and Australia, and the Japanese in Brazil, Canada, the United States, and Peru. Clearly, in these and other cases, the minority has simply outperformed the majority population, often in both the educational system and the economic system. Even when it is clear that some groups have excelled without any power to suppress or oppress other groups, there is often still a rankling sense of the injustice of it all. That a child born into one group has so much greater prospects of success in life than a child of no greater innate ability born into another group. Sometimes this is blamed on a lack of social justice, though the causes of such differences extend well beyond things controlled by any society, and which could therefore legitimately be called social. Each group trails the long shadow of its own history and culture, which influence its habits, priorities, and social patterns, which in turn affect its fate. If there is an injustice, it is an injustice which extends beyond the control of any existing government, institution, or society, because it involves the confluences of history, demography, culture, geography, and other factors, including luck. If there is an injustice, it is at this cosmic level, in the vagaries of fate. Lamenting the vagaries of fate may leave us with a galling sense of helpless frustration, which many escape by transforming the tragedy of the human condition into the specific sins of specific societies. This turns an insoluble problem of cosmic justice into an apparently more manageable issue of social justice. Since the sins of human beings are virtually inexhaustible, there is seldom a lack of examples of wrongdoing to which intergroup differences can be attributed, rightly or wrongly. Where the quest for injustice is overriding, among the things it overrides are logic and evidence. For example, various kinds of differences between whites and Aboriginal Australians were lumped together by a white Australian woman as examples of social injustice. The fact that I wake up each morning in a warm, safe, comfortable home, secure in the knowledge that the schools I send my children off to are organized to enhance their life chances and choices, and that good health, employment opportunities, and respect are the norm and not the goal in our lives, has been made possible through the 208-year exploitation of land that belonged to Indigenous Australians since the beginning of time. Here, differences in life chances are attributed to the seizure of land by the transplanted Europeans who settled Australia. If this were meant seriously as an empirical proposition, rather than an ideological indictment, then the most obvious question would be, were there no differences in life chances between the Europeans and the Aborigines before they met, when they were each living in their own respective homelands? Are differences today greater than they were then? None of this provides a moral justification for the invasion of Australia, but it raises a question about the causal claim that differences in life chances today are due to expropriations of land in the past, or exploitation of the indigenous people then or now. Had no invasion of Australia ever occurred, and this white Australian woman had been born in the land of her ancestors, probably England, would she not have awakened each morning to better circumstances and prospects than the Aborigines in a distant and undisturbed Australia? Nor would she have been any more deserving of this windfall gain in England than in Australia. Yet her sense of guilt for her personal advantages and her ancestors' sins is greater because she lives in Australia. More important, it leads her to a conclusion all too characteristic of the quest for cosmic justice, that the Aborigines should not have to change in order to achieve equality of results with whites in Australia. Clearly, the Aborigines would have had to change in order to achieve equality of economic results with Englishmen had both remained alone in their respective homelands. Yet those with the vision of cosmic justice want both groups to have the same effects without having the same causes when both are living in the same country. Such reasoning is by no means peculiar to Australia, much less to this particular Australian. Very much the same kind of reasoning, or lack of reasoning, has been used by a well-known American professor of history. I was born into a middle-class family of WASP ancestry. My parents prized education and sent all of their children to college. The cultural environment that encouraged white males to hope for careers at the top of the professional and business pyramid, but discouraged, inhibited, or prohibited women and minorities from doing the same, was a more powerful form of affirmative action than anything we have more recently experienced in the other direction. He and others like him were also beneficiaries of a sort of demographic affirmative action, since they were born during the trough of the Depression-era birth rate, so that they entered the job market just as the baby boom expansion in college enrollment created a greater demand for professors from the smaller preceding generation. What this professor chooses to call demographic affirmative action is an injustice only in some cosmic sense, rather than an injustice growing out of some chosen policy, like affirmative action. Since all things are the same except for the differences, and different except for the similarities, strained analogies like this may pass muster among those who are determined to ignore all differences internal to different groups of people. Despite vast differences in income and wealth between Europeans and Africans in their respective homelands, much smaller differences between the descendants of Europeans and the descendants of Africans in the United States are widely attributed to the sins of the former against the latter. Had both groups migrated voluntarily to America, and both been treated fairly, there would still have been no reason whatever to expect their economic levels to be the same, especially since people who did migrate voluntarily from different parts of Europe had income and wealth differences that were at one time greater than those between black and white Americans today. None of this denies that there were in fact sins committed by whites against blacks in the United States or by the British against the Aborigines in Australia. Those sins are not in dispute. The point here is that statistical disparities are not evidence of either the existence or the magnitude of those sins, for which there is ample other evidence. Such disparities are all too common around the world, with and without discrimination, with and without invasion, with and without slavery. This does not mean that these disparities are all due to individual merit. Inherited cultural advantages and disadvantages are windfall gains and windfall losses. More fundamentally, merit is a moral category, and confusing morality with causation is a fatal weakness in trying to understand history. Huge, unmerited, and unintentional differences in life chances have been common among Europeans in Europe. As an insightful scholar has aptly pointed out, a European child will have a very different life depending on whether that baby was born east or west of a line that starts at the Baltic and stretches southward along Poland's eastern border, down Slovakia's western border, and along the middle of Hungary, then continues down through the middle of Bosnia to the Adriatic Sea. There are historic, geographic, social, and other reasons for the large economic and other disparities between the life chances of people living in Eastern and Western Europe. These differences existed at least as far back as the Roman Empire, and, as late as 2003, the average per capita income in most Eastern European countries was less than half that of the Western European countries. Neither in Europe nor elsewhere do all the innumerable influences on people's fate balance out to produce the equality of outcome that is taken as a baseline from which to measure social injustices that are used to explain inequalities of result. Nor have the various causal factors involved implied any such moral notion as blaming the victim. Morality is not causation, and confusing the two does not advance either understanding or social improvement. In a sense, it is healthy that more prosperous individuals or societies recognize that their prosperity is not all due to what they themselves have done in their own lifetimes, but is, in fact, the fruit of the efforts and contributions made by many other people before they were born. However, gratitude for whatever has made their prosperity possible has, for many, been replaced by guilt for having been more fortunate than others. Thus their forebears are seen not as having bequeathed a valuable heritage, but as having perpetrated great injustices. The West in history. Some who assume the posture of citizens of the world view the survival of their own particular society as a matter of no great moment, viewing it as simply a matter of choosing among alternative political and social arrangements. But history shows that more than transformation is involved. A society or civilization may be destroyed, and its successor improvised from the ruins, not just the physical ruins, but from anarchy as the ruins of law and order, and ignorance as the ruins of system and education and other instruments of cultural transmission. After the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it was centuries, some estimate a millennium, before the standard of living in Western Europe rose again to the level it had reached in Roman times. The survival of a society or a civilization is not just a question of a preference for one particular set of political or social arrangements over another. It is easy to discuss alternative arrangements around a seminar table, as if transformations were no problem, but the painful alternatives amidst the ruins can be very different. Europeans lived for centuries with the presence of ruins more magnificent than anything they were capable of creating or even restoring. It is hardly surprising that they looked back at the ancients with awe long before they developed the modern Western tendency to look forward to greater accomplishments in the future than those of the past or the present. Another modern Western tendency, at least among the intelligentsia, is to be anti-Western, to apply double standards that ignore or excuse behavior in non-Western societies that would be excoriated in the West, or to picture the sins of the human race as if they were peculiarities of our society. Specific examples include the history of conquest, slavery, and war. Conquest. While European imperialism has been dominant in the past 500 years, in the preceding centuries, Europe was itself subjected to foreign conquests. It was invaded from Asia by the Mongols, to whom the Russians paid tribute. It was invaded from the Middle East by the Ottoman Empire, whose armies reached the gates of Vienna in the 16th century. Europe was invaded from North Africa, and the whole Iberian Peninsula was subjugated for centuries by the Moors. There was nothing peculiarly European about either conquering or being conquered, or about changing from one of these roles to the other in the course of history. The year in which the last of the North African conquerors was driven out of Spain, 1492, was the same year that marked the beginning of Europeans' creation of worldwide empires. Conquest, like slavery, existed on every inhabited continent, and involved all the races of mankind as both conquerors and subjugated peoples. Slavery and conquest existed in the Western Hemisphere before the first white man set foot on the shores of the Americas. The Zulus were conquering other African peoples when the British arrived in southern Africa and conquered them all. Europeans also displaced other conquerors in Asia and among the Polynesians. What was different about European imperialism was how widely scattered its empires were, which was possible only because of revolutions in naval technology and a pre-existing base of wealth available to finance overseas expansion. But morally, what the Europeans did was the same as what non-Europeans had been doing for thousands of years. This is not a moral justification for either, but it is an argument against the selective localization of evil. Against that background, it is possible to see what a gross distortion of history it is for schools to be asking American school children such questions as how they would feel if they were the indigenous American Indians being forced from their land by the westward movement of invaders from Europe. These children, with no historical background and coming from a society which condemns conquest, cannot possibly recreate the attitudes and beliefs which prevailed among either the Indians or the Europeans of earlier centuries. While today's American children would of course think it was wrong to take other people's lands by force, The American Indians had no such conception and took one another's lands by force, long before they ever laid eyes on a white man. Indeed, Indians often joined with the European invaders to attack other Indians, in order to share in the spoils or to exact revenge for these other Indians' prior spoliation of them, including the taking of their lands and the enslavement of their people. When Cortés marched against the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, he led an army of 900 Spaniards and thousands of Indians. No doubt those Indians forced off their lands in the United States or Brazil were bitter at being on the losing end of so many battles, but that is wholly different from a belief that battles were not the way to settle such things. No one wants to be conquered or enslaved, but that is wholly different from not wanting to be a conqueror or enslaver, or thinking that either or both are morally wrong. This is not a question of moral relativism or situational ethics. We may today condemn all conquests at all periods of history, but that is wholly different from imagining that such feelings were those of Indians in centuries past. Clearly, such "how would you feel" questions are put to American children and adults to advance a contemporary vision and a contemporary agenda, rather than to provide a realistic understanding of history. It is a betrayal of the trust of those who send their children to school to be educated, not manipulated. Studying Western imperialism in isolation from other non-Western imperialism, such as that of Genghis Khan or the Ottoman Turks, makes all the injustices, oppressions, and horrors incident to imperialism itself seem like depravities peculiar to the West. The tendentiousness of such a view of history stands out particularly when efforts are made to depict the United States as especially guilty of sins common to the human race around the world. One such history, after mentioning the Americans wresting the island remnants of Spain's empire in the Pacific and Caribbean during the Spanish-American War, declared that Russians were not comparably aggressive overseas. This was said not by a street corner demagogue, but by an academic scholar at a prestigious university. Russians, in reality, conquered vastly more area than the United States ever did, and continued to conquer after the United States began to withdraw from its few colonies. The difference was not in how aggressive Americans were, but in the fact that the United States had a powerful navy, and the Russians did not, so that the Russian Empire expanded through land conquests of contiguous territory. The word overseas allows the author an escape hatch, but the word aggressive describes an attitude, not a capability. The prevalence of European imperialism in general since the 16th century is likewise due to special capabilities rather than special attitudes. Whatever their attitudes may have been in the Middle Ages, Europeans lacked the military and economic capabilities required to become imperial powers on the world stage, just as most non-European countries have lacked that capability since then. The history of which peoples, nations, or civilizations have conquered or enslaved which other peoples, nations, or civilizations has been largely a history of who has been in a position to do so. Western cultural values. The misuse of history to condemn evils common around the world as if they were peculiarities of the West has serious practical implications. Two wrongs do not make a right, but undermining the society which has the smaller evil only makes it more vulnerable to the greater evils in other societies and in international terrorist networks. Far more is involved than questions of objectivity or honesty, important as such questions are. Without understanding the features of one's own society that have provided a prosperity, a freedom, and a security rare to non-existent over much of the rest of the world, one risks losing by default all these things for oneself and posterity. American society is one whose underlying bases are always under attack by both internal opportunists and external enemies. Those who have no conception of the Constitution of the United States, except as an object for nitpicking, cannot be expected to defend its integrity against the inevitable encroachments of political opportunists and judicial power seekers. Those who have no conception of the unique heritage of Western civilization have no idea what losing that heritage would mean to them and to generations yet unborn, and why it must be defended against passing fads at home and lethal threats from abroad. Freedom is one of those values of Western civilization whose uniqueness has been aptly highlighted by Professor Orlando Patterson of Harvard. For most of human history, and for nearly all of the non-Western world prior to Western contact, freedom was, and for many still remains, anything but an obvious or desirable goal. Other values and ideals were or are of far greater importance to them. Values such as the pursuit of glory, honor, and power for oneself or one's family and clan, nationalism and imperial grandeur, militarism and valor in warfare, filial piety, the harmony of heaven and earth, the spreading of the true faith, nirvana, hedonism, altruism, justice, equality, material progress, the list is endless. But almost never, outside the context of Western culture and its influence, has it included freedom. Indeed, non-Western people have thought so little about freedom that most human languages did not even possess a word for the concept before contact with the West. It would take a vast study to elaborate the benefits that the West has created for itself and for the world. Advances in science, technology, and medicine are some of the more obvious, but Western advances in the realm of ideas and institutions have been fundamental as well, though these have not always traveled as well when transplanted into cultures very different from the cultures in which these ideas and institutions evolved over the centuries. Here it may be useful to sketch just two fundamental Western mental products, a universalistic conception of human beings and the rule of law. Perhaps the most important and certainly the most distinctive characteristic of Western civilization since at least the 18th century has been a growing universalism. Nothing has been more common among human beings around the world, and for thousands of years of history, than to disregard the troubles inflicted on other people outside the group to which they happen to belong. Some have taken positive pleasure in their ability to dominate, oppress, humiliate, or kill others, as, for example, Genghis Khan did. The Mayans developed to a high art form both the prolonged tortures and humiliations they heaped upon those they had conquered, and the commemoration of such acts in their art. Nor had such things died out in the 20th century, when the Japanese in World War II delighted in savaging and humiliating American and other prisoners of war, as well as civilians in their conquered territories, and when their Nazi allies found mass slaughter not enough unless it was accomplished by soul-searing degradations inflicted on inmates of their concentration camps. No society thus far has entirely escaped this older tendency. In other words, universalism has not yet become universal in any society. Nor did universalism, in terms of having regard for other people's feelings or well-being, imply any sense of equality in ability or even likability. It simply meant that all people deserved to be treated decently and fairly, whomever they might be, and whatever the state of their ability or their culture. Nothing epitomized this universalism more than Queen Victoria's concern about the fate of slaves in other lands. When Uncle Tom's Cabin author Harriet Beecher Stowe was granted an audience with Her Majesty during a trip to England, she found the Queen able to discuss the Dred Scott case in great detail, as well as saying she had wept over some of the passages in the novel. There could hardly be a greater social distance than that between the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known and a slave being whipped in another country on the other side of an ocean. Yet this universalism was more than an incidental phenomenon in Western civilization. It fueled a worldwide crusade against slavery for more than a century, and the fact that it took more than a century to destroy slavery over most of the world clearly indicates that this universalism did not prevail outside of Western civilization. One of the implications of universalism is that those who are more fortunate need not be any more deserving than those in misery. For some, this suggests an imperative for redistribution of wealth, while for some others it may suggest a sharing of the knowledge and development of the habits, priorities, and values that would enable others to create wealth for themselves. For those who believe the latter, simply giving people things is counterproductive from the standpoint of getting them to become productive themselves. Nor is what is given likely to equal what the recipients could have created for themselves if the sources of productivity had been shared rather than the fruits. Like anything human, universalism can take foolish forms, as with the Australian woman who confused morality and causation, as so many others have done when seeking historical redress for historical abstractions at the expense of creating new problems for flesh and blood human beings. Another great Western advance has been the rule of law, again, as with universalism, not everywhere or at all times, but sufficiently to become a characteristic distinguishing Western from non-Western societies. Every society has its rules or its laws, but the rule of law implies far more than this. When the English beheaded King Charles I, this made unmistakably clear to all at the time and to the generations that followed throughout the English-speaking world that no one was above the law. Decades later, when Charles II learned that his subjects were reacting adversely, Charles II. When Charles II learned that his subjects were reacting adversely to his expansive conception of his role as king, he found it prudent to sneak out of London in the middle of the night, cross the Channel to France, and never return to the British Isles. In many other societies, especially non-Western societies, the notion that the supreme ruler was subject to the law would be foreign, if not incomprehensible. In many of these societies, the ruler's word was itself law. The rule of law implies more than the principle that no one is above the law. It implies also that those with power cannot take action against individuals without some prior evidence of violations of existing laws and some prior determination through institutionally established due process that the individual in question is, in fact, guilty of transgressing specific prohibitions. What this means for individual freedom and dignity can be illustrated by seeing what can happen in the absence of such safeguards. When Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire ordered one of his subjects to bring his adolescent son to him for his own sexual pleasure, and the subject declined, they were both decapitated and their heads displayed before the Sultan at his banquet table. Western conceptions of the rule of law in general, and the Constitution of the United States in particular, reflect a vivid awareness of the dangers of power, and the need to divide that power among different institutions that can counterbalance one another. The principles implicit in the Constitution were made explicit in The Federalist, the collection of popular essays designed to explain to 18th century Americans why the Constitution was written as it was, in order to persuade them to ratify this new document on which a new nation would be built. While the rule of law is distinctive to Western civilization, it has not been pervasive at all times and places within that civilization. Even in England, its evolution took centuries. Although the kinds of free societies which emerged in the West were often called democracies in the 20th century, they were societies with the rule of law long before they were societies in which democratic majorities chose political leaders. More than 700 years elapsed between Magna Carta and universal adult suffrage in England or the United States. While some non-Western societies have selectively adopted varying aspects of Western civilization, that is very different from saying that Western nations can directly export democracy to non-Western lands, even those that they have conquered militarily. While they can bring the outward forms of Western culture, an independent judiciary, elections, markets, technology, what they cannot export are the centuries of evolution that led up to these things, and the resulting ingrained traditions and attitudes which enable Western institutions to function. A far more urgent challenge faces the West than spreading its culture to other lands. The real culture war is within Western civilization itself, and history is one of its crucial battlegrounds. In addition to the usual disputes over particular facts or their interpretation, there is a more fundamental and more pervasive attempt to make the sins of the human race look like peculiar depravities of Western civilization. Thus, Uganda's brutal expulsion of 50,000 Asians in the 1970s and Britain's acceptance of some of them as refugees was described this way by an American scholar. The crowning disgrace in the treatment of East African Asians came when the United Kingdom refused entry to Asian holders of British passports who had been booted out of Kenya. At least South Africa does not prevent its own citizens from entering its borders. If the mother of parliaments and the cradle of Western democracy behaved more badly towards them than the most racist tyranny in the world, what do Asians have to look forward to? Britain's sense of not having an unlimited capacity to absorb refugees was denounced more strongly than the Africans' arbitrary expulsions, which is what created the problem in the first place. Most of these Asians had lived in Africa for generations and had never lived in Britain. The fact that those expelled held British passports from the days of the British Empire did not mean they had ever been part of the society of the British Isles or could be readily absorbed there in unlimited numbers. None of this, however, was allowed to inhibit the seizing of an opportunity to condemn the West, again by a respected academic scholar, not a street corner demagogue. Summary and implications. We do not have a choice whether or not to discuss history. History has always been invoked in contemporary controversies. The only choice is between discussing what actually happened in the past and discussing notions projected into the past for present purposes. History is the memory of the human race. For an individual to wake up some morning with no memory would be devastating. In addition to the emotional trauma of suddenly finding everything and everybody unknown and unfathomable, there would be no way to carry out the practical necessities of work or managing a home, much less maintaining or establishing relations with other human beings. It would not be much better to wake up some morning with a false memory, induced in you by some means by some other person, to serve that other person's purposes, with all memories expunged that do not serve that end, and other memories twisted or created out of thin air, to make you the willing instrument of some ulterior design. Much has been written about the sheer neglect of history in our educational institutions, with students able to graduate from some of the most prestigious colleges in the land without having had a single course in the history of their own country or of the world. Far more insidious and dangerous, however, is the promotion of a history created as a projection into the past of current notions and agendas. History, with its integrity as a record of the past intact, is a gold mine of experience from many times and peoples under a wider range of circumstances than any given generation can find in its own time. Contemporary plans, theories, beliefs, and hopes can be checked against the record of what has happened in the past when similar notions were put into practice. Merely to discover how often the same ideas have occurred to others centuries ago can be a sobering experience for those inclined to become carried away by supposedly new and brilliant insights about an unprecedented situation. But history cannot be a reality check for visions when history is itself shaped by visions. There has been much hand-wringing about the difficulty or impossibility of achieving objectivity in writing history. If there is anyone who is objective, it is hard to imagine how others who are not objective would know that. The unattainability of objectivity is too often a distraction from something more mundane that is quite attainable but is often absent: honesty. When facts about racial or ethnic groups that are both known and relevant are deliberately suppressed because they would undermine a particular vision, doctrine, or agenda, then history is prostituted and cannot serve as a check against visions, because facts have been subordinated to visions. Objectivity is too often a red herring. No one makes the impossible demand that mathematicians be objective, but that does not mean that the logic of geometry or equations depends on how each individual chooses to look at it. Nor can a mathematician who gets his geometry or equations wrong take refuge in the truism that no one is objective. Neither should historians be able to find refuge in such truisms. None of this denies that there are honest differences in interpreting history, but that in turn cannot deny that there are also dishonest differences. The pretense of looking at history from someone else's point of view, that of the downtrodden or the dispossessed, for example, is just one example, for neither today's author nor reader can achieve such a feat when discussing the past. Taking sides. From the undeniable fact that an individual person's leanings for or against particular groups, nations, or civilizations can influence the way that that individual sees history, some have concluded that it is just a matter of choosing sides when writing history, and looking at history from the viewpoint of those whose side one is taking. As the author of a widely read history text says, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish. One need only ask how many slaves, the vast majority of whom were illiterate, contemplated the Constitution of the United States at all, to see the absurdity of such posturing. As for the Arawaks, the first people Columbus encountered in the Western Hemisphere, none has survived, and none left any writings. How Columbus or Andrew Jackson or any other historic figure looked to any Western Hemisphere Indians is knowledge vouchsafed only to those Indians at that time, certainly not to other centuries, removed from the scene, living in a very different cultural universe, and possessing not even isolated written statements from the indigenous peoples, much less any scientifically conducted polls among them. We may, from our own viewpoint today, lament that bloody and brutal conquests took place at all, but that is by no means to say that the Indians themselves rejected bloody and brutal conquests, or that they lamented anything about the battles that took place other than the fact that they lost most of them. What their true feelings were, we can only speculate about. To look at history as a matter of taking sides is to turn the human failing of bias, which mars what we do to a greater or lesser extent, into a principle that is to permeate and pollute our whole endeavor. It is an all-or-nothing argument, that if we cannot completely eliminate bias, then we should give it free rein, perhaps even congratulating ourselves for having admitted our biases. Perfection is not attainable in any aspect of human life, but does that mean we should turn imperfections into virtues? Does the fact that we cannot eliminate 100% of the impurities in the air or water mean we should celebrate smog or polluted water and boast of our realism? Making a case for or against an individual group or society is fundamentally different from seeking the facts and analyzing the context and constraints which explain those facts. Making an indictment may be easier and more emotionally satisfying than following the ancient admonition, with all you're getting, get understanding. Neither indictments nor apologies are the same as understanding, nor is a preconceived neutrality. The truth does not necessarily lie somewhere in between. Like anything else, only after you find it can you know where it is. Taking sides too easily degenerates into being morally one-up, and imagining that we would have handled the problems of the past so much better than those who were there. Nothing is easier than creating higher standards for judging other people. Intellectuals whose whole careers are built around words are especially vulnerable to the temptation to judge historic figures by their words. Thus, the wording of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation has been a disappointment to many, then as now. Without a sense of context and of the constraints and dangers inherent in that context, it may be hard to understand that ringing words of moral passion could have aroused far more legal challenge and political backlash than a mundane assertion of military necessity in wartime. It was by no means a foregone conclusion that the Emancipation Proclamation would have survived such challenges, and its purpose was to survive, to free millions of human beings, not to seek a place in the anthologies. Some historic figures, Winston Churchill, for example, are renowned for both their words and their deeds, but a historic figure such as George Washington contributed little to the anthologies while making landmark contributions to the creation of a new kind of nation, and, by example, to the development of free societies in the modern world. The issue, however, is not simply one of assigning the proper stature to individuals. More fundamentally, the task is to assess causation. But those seeking moral indictments too often condemn past leaders for not having made such futile gestures as putting a clause banning slavery in the Constitution, when such a clause would have banned the Constitution itself from the South, making that section a separate nation in which slavery is unlikely to have been ended as early as Lincoln ended it. Among the many other distortions of history growing out of a posture of taking sides is casting particular groups or societies in the role of victims, while overlooking their victimization of others. Peoples subjugated and oppressed by others have often been the objects of solicitude by intellectuals, as well as by political movements seeking their liberation. Yet time and again, that liberation has been followed almost immediately by the liberated peoples oppressing the minorities now subject to their power. The grandly proclaimed right of self-determination of peoples, used by the victors in the First World War as a rationale for breaking up the defeated Habsburg and Ottoman empires, led to waves of intolerance and oppression against the minorities within the newly freed or newly created nations of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, oppressions that have not yet ceased even in the 21st century. It was much the same story after the Second World War, when the Malays gained their independence from the British and the Indonesians from the Dutch. Both immediately began discriminating against their Chinese minorities. Nor was newly liberated Europe exempt from such persecutions of minorities, beginning with the expulsions of millions of Germans, including people from families that had settled in Eastern Europe or the Balkans centuries earlier. When the nations of Africa began achieving independence during the 1960s, those in East Africa likewise began discriminating against their Asian minorities, and the nations of West Africa began discriminating against their Lebanese minorities. In many cases, mob violence punctuated this discrimination. Even indigenous minorities were targeted in some newly independent African nations, the Igbos in Nigeria, for example. Nor were newly freed colonies in the Caribbean exempt from these patterns, with Indians and Pakistanis being targeted in Trinidad and Guyana. In all these cases, Western intellectuals who had taken sides against European imperial powers and in favor of liberating these nations tended to pass over in silence outrages more severe than those they had protested vigorously against when committed by Europeans against indigenous peoples. On a smaller scale, this pattern recurred in the United States, when blacks, freed from various legal and social oppressions by the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, in many cases turned anti-Jewish and anti-Asian in both words and deeds, including murders of store owners during ghetto riots. The very word racism was then redefined to exclude groups without power, so that the most anti-Semitic rantings or anti-Asian violence committed by blacks was exempted from the term, even though power had never been a prerequisite for defining racism before the need to exempt black racism arose. Reaching conclusions after the fact is not the same as taking sides before the facts, even if those conclusions reflect credit or discredit on different individuals or groups. Reaching conclusions after the fact is not the same as taking sides before the facts, even if those conclusions reflect credit or discredit on different individuals or groups to differing degrees. The historian is the agent of the reader. That is whose side is supposed to be served, and it is a conflict of interests to set out to serve some other cause while pretending to be informing the reader. A hypercritical view of one's own society or civilization may express a sense of personal guilt for the undeserved good fortune of being a member of a society whose economic, political, and social benefits far exceed those available to other people of no less merit, who happen to live in other kinds of societies, or in a different social setting within the same society. Wanting to line up on the side of such people may be a generous impulse, but it can also be a dangerous self-indulgence. Such moral partisanship is unlikely to do much good to those unfortunate enough to be born without the social and cultural prerequisites for prosperity or freedom. Whatever chances such people have of acquiring the missing ingredients for their own advancement are reduced to the extent that their problems are misdiagnosed as the sins of other people, rather than the things they themselves lack, even if they lack those things for reasons beyond their control. Often the things they lack can be acquired sooner and more extensively than they can either reform other people or get the society as a whole to provide for them, through a redistribution of existing wealth, what they are capable of producing for themselves through an upgrading of their own productivity. Moreover, rising productivity adds to the net wealth of the society and the world, which is more likely to gain the respect of others, as well as self-respect, than are reiterated pleas or demands for a share of what others have created. Looking at history as a matter of taking sides encourages the collectivization of people, not only as of a given time, but also over time, so that Germans, or Czechs, for example, become intertemporal abstractions. This creates not only intellectual problems, but even more painful and sometimes catastrophic practical problems in the real world. For example, the confiscation of the lands of Czech nobles who revolted against the Habsburg Empire in 1620 meant a transfer of vast amounts of land to people of German ancestry, a process which leaders of the newly created nation of Czechoslovakia, after the First World War, sought to reverse in the name of social justice, so as to put right the historic wrongs of the 17th century. Obviously, no one from the 17th century was still alive to be either punished or rewarded, so Germans and Czechs were being conceived of as intertemporal abstractions, and the reversal of historic wrongs was to be done with flesh and blood people alive in the 20th century. Both Germans and Czechs went through horrible and murderous traumas over the next several decades as a result of events set in motion to reverse what had happened 3 centuries earlier. These traumas included the dismemberment of the country as a result of the Munich crisis of 1938, provoked by the embittered German minority that had been discriminated against within Czechoslovakia in the name of social justice. And then, after the Second World War, massive and brutal expulsions of Germans from Czechoslovakia, with losses of lives by the tens of thousands. Both Germans and Czechs in the 20th century ended up far worse off than if 17th century issues had been left in the 17th century. The confusion of intertemporal abstractions with living flesh and blood human beings has by no means been confined to Czechs and Germans, or even to people under the hypnotic sway of demagogues. A very thoughtful book about various Asian countries, for example, noted the lack of remorse among those Japanese who committed hideous atrocities against defenseless people in the lands they conquered during the Second World War, but added, "The United States, after all, has never formally apologized for enslaving Africans, invading Mexico and Canada, stealing Texas, colonizing the Philippines or Guam, or carpet-bombing Vietnam." The distinction between living, flesh-and-blood Japanese military veterans who personally committed atrocities and an intertemporal abstraction of Americans committing various acts over a period of centuries was simply ignored. Intertemporal abstractions not only facilitate taking sides, such abstractions can also facilitate moral equivalence, such as that between people who committed atrocities against the defenseless and those whose only offense is being born descended from people who committed evil acts in the past. There is a slippery versatility to intertemporal abstractions. These abstractions can, among other things, promote invidious comparisons, stretching across centuries, and also create a zero-sum concept of the world, in which gains of one group or nation mean losses for other groups or nations. It can also promote a dog-in-the-manger mentality, in which the good fortune of others is a grievance to be prevented or avenged, whether or not that good fortune can be shown to have produced any ill effect on others. Thus, When Nigeria became independent in 1960, a high priority on the agenda of the political authorities in northern Nigeria was getting rid of southern Nigerians, who held many desirable positions in civil administration and in the economy of the northern region, even though there were not nearly enough educated or experienced northern Nigerians to replace them. The southern Nigerians were nevertheless forced out, even when this left vacancies that had to be filled with European expatriates. Resentment of better educated or more entrepreneurial groups has been by no means peculiar to Nigeria. Such groups have been targeted, expelled, or forced to flee for their lives from countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific, not to mention black ghettos in the United States. In many cases, those who forced them out have suffered economic devastation afterwards from the loss of the skills, talents, experience, and businesses of those who departed. After the expulsion of the Moriscos from 16th century Spain, a bishop who had favored that expulsion nevertheless asked, "Who will make our shoes now?" It was a question that might well have been asked before the expulsions, and the kind of question that might well be asked by others with a dog-in-the-manger view. One of the consequences of looking at the study of history as an occasion for taking sides, rather than seeking the truth, is that this taking sides has often led to a twisting of events to produce the desired condemnation of the other side. More fundamental than a twisting of particular events, however, has been a general forcing of historical episodes into a preconceived pattern based on an ideological vision, even when that requires turning historical figures and the complex circumstances in which they acted into editorial cartoon characters in a cartoon world. Another consequence of the taking sides perspective is that many then see strong group solidarity as a prerequisite for the victory of the side they have chosen. But where the advancement of one group is not seen as axiomatically taking the form of victory over some other oppressing group, it cannot be assumed a priori that the benefits of solidarity exceed their costs. Groupthink does not always lead to wiser decisions than what emerges from a clash of differing individual ideas from within and beyond the group. More dangerously, group solidarity often means letting the lowest common denominator shape the culture and life within the group and determine the direction of its future. This can range from black students being accused of acting white for being conscientious about their studies, to automatic criticisms of police actions against rioters or criminals. These are self-inflicted wounds that can jeopardize the whole future of a people. Repudiating criminals whose principal victims are members of their own group is imperative, and casting aside counterproductive aspects of the group culture can be essential for advancement. Contrary to popular belief, highly successful groups do not all stick together. The history of such groups as the Jews, the Lebanese, the overseas Chinese, and others clearly belies this belief. Chinese American leaders, for example, at one time urged San Francisco policemen, mostly white, to crack down on young Chinese hoodlums and gangsters, including administering curbstone justice with vigorous use of billy clubs. Moreover, some elements within the Chinese American community apparently took their own actions, for the bound and gagged bodies of some of these criminals were found floating in the San Francisco Bay. Group-wide solidarity that includes hoodlums and criminals means absorbing enormous costs imposed on the rest of the ethnic community, not only directly as victims of crime, but also indirectly when businesses and jobs flee the community, leaving an economic wasteland. Chinese American leaders were particularly sensitive to this possibility because much of the prosperity of the Chinatown area in San Francisco depended on its remaining a place attracting large numbers of tourists. By contrast, it has long been the practice of black Americans to protect any Negro from the whites, even when they happen not to like that individual Negro, as Gunnar Myrdal put it more than half a century ago. Such tendencies have only increased since then. Such automatic group solidarity ties the fate of the community as a whole to the fate of its most unsavory elements in many ways. It not only identifies the community with the acts of these individuals in the eyes of the larger society, it puts great leverage in the hands of irresponsible and criminal elements whose actions can cause backlashes against blacks in general, whether in the form of political reactions, social isolation, violence, or simply the withdrawal of businesses from black neighborhoods, taking jobs and a tax base with them. Where a particular group culture is itself a handicap, impeding the acquisition of the education, skills, and experience required for economic and other advancement, group solidarity can have huge and lifelong consequences with staggering costs. Even with such mundane things as the prices charged in local stores, group solidarity can obscure the causes of higher prices, which often confront lower-income people. The costs created by crime and violence are often blamed on outsiders who charge these high prices rather than on the local delinquent and criminal elements that create the costs which these prices reflect. Group solidarity may not only seal a group off from the larger surrounding society, it may seal them off from the truth about the internal causes of their own problems, making a solution more remote. The prevailing vision is one of a solidified minority in a stance of defiance against the larger society, with minority leaders and activists ever ready to protest police actions against any members of the community. Outside intellectuals, celebrities, politicians, judges, and others who see racial and ethnic issues as a matter of taking sides may also adopt this posture in order to be on the side of the minority community, perhaps in order to atone for their own good fortune. But such a stance and such a vision impose great costs on the community that they intend to help, though these outsiders pay no part of any of those costs, and so have little or no incentive to scrutinize their social vision and its assumptions to discover their actual effects. One of the subsidiary notions growing out of group solidarity is that of role models. Efforts to find, praise, or exaggerate the numbers and achievements of these role models can be counterproductive by insinuating the idea that people can be inspired only by others who physically resemble themselves. But history has repeatedly demonstrated the falsity of that notion. Japan went from being a backward feudal society to becoming a modern industrial nation by learning from Europeans and Americans, both by sending their students to study in Europe and the United States, and by bringing Europeans and Americans to Japan to teach the needed skills or to provide the industrial experience required to launch Japanese industries. In the United States, the immigrant generation of Jewish children in the late 19th and early 20th century New York City were largely taught by Irish Catholic teachers, while the generation of black children arriving in Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s were far more often taught by Jewish teachers than by black teachers. In both cases, these were the generations that rose into positions that their parents had seldom achieved. The second generation of Japanese American children likewise rose to positions that their parents, overwhelmingly farmers, had never achieved. Moreover, Japanese American youngsters of that generation were unlikely ever to have had a Japanese American teacher or to have seen a Japanese American working in any professional or scientific field, even though these became fields in which Japanese Americans later excelled. The notion of role models is not merely false, but pernicious when it becomes part of the straitjacket of groupthink. Lessons of history. History, whose integrity has not been compromised by contemporary agendas, is not irrelevant to our times. On the contrary, it can often be of great value, not only in correcting factual errors, but also in dispelling feelings and attitudes that needlessly encumber our lives today. For example, Shelby Steele has aptly pointed out that much that is said and done today that makes no sense in itself is a result of a desperate desire of whites to avoid being considered racists, and a desperate desire of blacks to avoid being considered inferior. For blacks, there is also a desire to escape the stigma of being a race which shamefully submitted to the degradation of slavery. Honest history deflates such distractions from the task of dealing with today's problem today. While racism has sometimes been a major factor in history, it has often been a result of slavery, for example, instead of an autonomous cause, and in any event, its waxing and waning in the history of white reactions to black Americans shows that its effects are neither immutable nor inevitable. It is futile for people who are not racists to try endlessly to prove a negative. Nor should people who are in fact racists be exempt from the charge because of verbal sleight of hand, such as adding a proviso of power to the definition. It is equally futile and equally unnecessary for blacks to try and prove a negative, that they are not genetically inferior or not less manly than other races in having submitted to slavery. The notion that blacks were unusual in submitting to slavery is one that cannot survive any serious study of the history of slavery around the world. Every race was enslaved, and few were in any position to revolt, much less to succeed in their uprisings. Slavery could not have lasted for thousands of years around the world if it could be readily overthrown by rebellion. The most famous slave revolt, that of Spartacus in ancient Rome, ended in a devastating defeat of the slaves, and mass agonizing deaths publicly inflicted on them. Neither Europeans, Asians, or Africans escaped the fate of being slaves or the guilt of being enslavers. Only in unusual circumstances, where the slave population greatly outnumbered the enslaving race, for example, were slave uprisings likely to succeed, even locally, or communities of escaped slaves likely to survive, as among blacks in some Caribbean islands. One of the painful consequences of a history constrained by contemporary agendas and contemporary attitudes has been a taboo against researching and discussing the history of IQ and other mental tests among various groups. This social taboo has in recent times been backed up by legal restrictions on giving IQ tests to black school children, and in too many cases, by campus disruptions and violence against speakers attempting to discuss research and conclusions on this subject that others disagree with. But only research and analysis by those who have defied the taboos has brought out the fact that people of a variety of ancestries in countries around the world have had average IQ scores at the same level as that of blacks in the United States. In India, for example, mental test score differences among various groups are even greater than those between black and white Americans. Only historical research has brought out regional differences in mental test results that cut across racial lines, so that white soldiers in various southern states scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from various northern states during the First World War. Only historical research has brought out the fact that black children attending Dunbar High School in Washington consistently equaled or exceeded the national average on IQ tests for decades, even though they were a substantial proportion of all black high school students in the city and were not pre-selected for admission by mental tests. Indeed, there were some students at Dunbar with subnormal IQs, but they were offset by others whose IQs considerably exceeded the national average. The weightiest evidence of all has been the historical research of James R. Flynn, showing what has been called the Flynn effect, that, contrary to both the logic and the predictions of believers in genetic determination of IQs, national performances on IQ tests have risen substantially over the years in more than a dozen countries, with black Americans at the end of the 20th century answering as many IQ test questions correctly as whites answered in the middle of that century. This does not change the racial gap, but it undermines genetic determinism as an explanation for that gap. None of this would have been known if the taboo on IQ research had not been defied, and much of this research would not have been done without the previous research of those who concluded that IQ differences were largely due to genetic differences. In other areas as well, history shows that initially mistaken beliefs have provided the impetus for study and research, which advanced human understanding beyond where it was before the mistaken beliefs arose. Chemistry, for example, developed out of discredited alchemy, and astronomy out of astrology. In an age of clashing civilizations and of hatreds so fierce as to provoke suicide terrorism, history is both a treasure chest of experience and a powder keg. As Edmund Burke aptly put it more than 2 centuries ago, in history, a great volume is unrolled for our instruction, drawing the materials of future wisdom from the past errors and infirmities of mankind. It may, in the perversion, serve for a magazine furnishing offensive and defensive weapons, and supplying the means of keeping alive or reviving dissensions and animosities, and adding fuel to the civil fury. While the lessons of history can be valuable, the twisting of history and the mining of the past for grievances can tear a society apart. Past grievances, real or imaginary, are equally irremediable in the present, for nothing that is done among living contemporaries can change in the slightest the sins and sufferings of generations who took those sins and sufferings to the grave with them in centuries past. Galling as it may be to be helpless to redress the crying injustices of the past, symbolic expiation in the present can only create new injustices among the living and new problems for the future when newborn babies enter the world with prepackaged grievances against other babies born the same day. Both have their futures jeopardized, not only by their internal strife, but also by the increased vulnerability of a disunited society to external dangers from other nations and from international terrorist networks. To be relevant to our times, history must not be controlled by our times. Its integrity as a record of the past is what allows us to draw lessons from it. One of the most chilling lessons of the history of the 20th century is how deceptive domestic tranquility can be in a multi-ethnic society, when it takes only the right circumstances and the right demagogue to turn neighbor murderously against neighbor. There was not a single race riot between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka during the first half of the 20th century, and the relations between the two groups at mid-century were regarded by many observers as a model for how different ethnic groups could coexist in harmony. Yet the second half of the century saw not only massive and lethal riots between these two groups, but also unspeakable atrocities inflicted on individuals from one group who just happened to fall into the hands of the other group. Moreover, all this fomented hatred and violence escalated into a full-scale civil war, in which this small country suffered more deaths than the United States suffered during all the long years of the Vietnam War. Both sides lost, and they lost because they became sides, instead of remaining fellow countrymen with different cultures. Sri Lanka was not unique. Neighbors who had lived in peace for years or even generations turned on one another murderously in Indonesia, in the Balkans, and in sub-Saharan Africa, as ethnic polarization and strife were stirred up by either fanatics or opportunists. In Germany in the 1920s, Jews were so widely accepted socially that nearly half of all Jewish marriages in Germany during that decade were marriages with non-Jews. But that did not prevent the Holocaust. While history is an explicit legacy of the past, cultural patterns and traditions are its inarticulate legacy in the differential survival of varying practices. Many who seek to subordinate history to current visions and agendas likewise